So I made this video as to why we always talk about race and gender in sociology classes. And so I want to talk about sex and gender in a lot of the same way. And one of the things that I want to do right away is start out with some general terminology. When I talk about sex, what I'm talking about are the physical or physiological differences between males and females. It includes both primary sex characteristics, so those parts of our body that's involved with the reproductive system, and secondary characteristics such as height and muscularity, so those characteristics that we develop when we become of reproductive age. So one of the things that's important is that when I talk about bodies, male and female are our typical bodies. But there's a lot of differentiation in between that because we're just biological animals. And so our breeding happens typically one way or the other, but it's not always so clear cut in that way. There's a really cool video that talks about sex differences. I'll find it and I'll link it here. But if we're still using this one particular textbook, it might already be linked to the chapter on sex and gender called Sex Differences. For that reason, when I'm talking about sexuality, I'm talking about the capacity to experience sexual feelings and attraction. Or more importantly, when you're talking about sexuality, you're only really still focusing on bodies, right? The feelings and attractions related to physical and physiological differences between one body and another body. Again, typically male bodies and female bodies when we're talking about sex. And so when I'm talking about sexualities, we're talking about the ways that those bodies interact with one another. One's sexual orientation is their physical, mental, emotional, or sexual attraction to a particular sex. So whether you are particularly attracted to males or particularly attracted to females, this is where we understand sexual orientation. That might be heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, pansexual. There's other determinations. It's really a question on that spectrum, again, of bodies, how those bodies interact, how those bodies are attracted to one another, and one's preference or orientation for how those bodies should interact with one another. So there's no single word anyway. So even though I give you heterosexual and homosexual, for instance, those are the two that we might go to, or bisexual, there's no single word that usually encompasses everything about sexual attraction across everybody's entire lifetime. Again, I might talk about typically male or typically female or typically heterosexual or typically homosexual, but those are our abilities to use language to talk about these things, not because they are all encompassing in general. So much so that sometimes we might talk about, there's a film that I don't usually show all the time. Sometimes we might even talk about things like homosocial, which is non-sexual same-sex interactions, like hugging and hand holding and physical closeness, the things that girls do with one another, or the ways that boys might interact when they're playing sports, but not when they are out in any other way. So even when we're describing the ways that we can talk about how bodies relate to one another, we might be talking about that in sexual ways, where we're talking about interactions that are sexual and emotional attractiveness, or we could just be talking about the ways that these bodies interact without the non-sexual components that come with it. So why does this matter? Again, you are born in a particular society. You didn't ask to be here. Society was going on before you showed up. And, part of your task is to figure out how you fit. These differences amongst bodies are already there. You showed up in one of them, right? And one of those most important distinctions, particularly when we think about sex as typically male or female, and these primary and secondary reproductive characteristics, is reproduction. as a society, we've got a severe interest in making sure that we reproduce, right? If we stop, then society goes away. Remember, there are no other subspecies of humans, it's just us. So if we want to recreate and maintain our society, then we've got to reproduce, right? Sexual behavior is universal in all species. All societies will have something to understand related to how they reproduce themselves. How do they maintain their existence, right? And so while sexual behavior is universal, our attitudes about that sexual behavior is not. It's not the same in every society. Our thoughts and feelings and values and attitudes about how bodies should interact. That's not a universal. We don't believe the same thing all the time. So when we talk about all societies practice social control, and by doing so, they figure out what that social order is so that they can maintain social control. What comes along with that is a question or a set of attitudes about what is okay, what's normal, what's deviant, what's not, and then managing, socially controlling, making sure that people do what they're supposed to do and not do what they're supposed to do, because we are interested in sort of regulating sexual behavior, because sexual behavior is tied to reproduction, and reproduction is tied to our very existence and our very ability to stay in society. So, no different than we were talking about class or race, we are right back to talking about the same stratification system. There are a number of ways that bodies can interact with one another. There are a number of feelings that people can have for one another in terms of how those bodies interact with one another. Even the spectrum between typically male and typically female. There's a lot that can be included in that when we're talking about sex and sexual orientation, right? But we care because we are, as a society, always practicing social control so that we can maintain social order. One of the ways that we're doing that immediately is in the family, because it is our family, the smallest social unit, for instance, that is primarily concerned with the reproduction of our society's members. We need people to get together and have sex and produce babies. So, one of those places where we start to see sex and gender matter, mind you, I hadn't even mentioned gender yet. The place where we see this matter the most, or first and foremost, is in our families. It's the most integral component of society. So when we think about the ways that our bodies are normalized and the ways that we think they're supposed to be one way or the other, the first place we look to find that detail, or we look to maintain order, or we practice our biggest amounts of social control related to sex, for instance, is inside the family. We care about social arrangements that promote and ensure the preservation of family, because sexual activity needs to happen within the confines of those relationships that we legally recognize, because it's the best chance that we have for new members of society to be socialized. It's the best chances that we have for new members of society to get the things that they need. So, sex, bodies, sex between bodies, preferences for that sex between bodies, what we consider to be right or normal or acceptable. There's, you know, all of those sort of questions of how do we maintain or practice social control to maintain order. We tend to find those happening inside of families where we're regulating sexual activity in order to socialize members of society, and in order to make sure that our society members get what they need. So this is where we start to find terms like heteronormative societies, which is when people generally assume that a heterosexual orientation is biologically determined and it's the default or normal type of orientation. And the reason why we would think that heterosexism is the most normal is because that's typically what we think of when we think about sexuality necessary in order to maintain the reproduction of a society, right? Sexism, remember we talked already about prejudiceness, prejudgment of people. Sexism is just a prejudiced belief that values one sex or the other. So when we think about maintaining social control in order to maintain order, oftentimes when we talk about sexism in our society, we're talking about traditions or values that prioritize the male sex over the female sex, for instance. And we can find legalities and policies that created that kind of social control to maintain that order because we have a vested interest in making sure that women are reproducing babies and taking care of families in the ways that whatever society we have, however we think that that's supposed to go. Heterosexism, then, is the ideology of or a set of institutional practices that privilege straight people and heterosexuality over other sexual orientations. All of this will boil back down to that same stratification. Again, sometimes we stratify by class, sometimes we stratify by race. And in this case, I'm suggesting we also stratify by sex because at the very least, as a society, we have a vested interest in maintaining order the way that we culturally think that we should maintain order. And in so doing, we will create controls that maintain that order. And that will generally default to how we think bodies should interact. And we can regulate how we think bodies should interact, first and foremost, by regulating what is allowable or not allowable sexual relationships and sexual joinings or partnerships through our family units. And that's typically how we've done it. As we over time challenge the way that these family units are, or challenge the way that these family units can be, or challenge the legalities and the policies that privilege one family structure over another family structure, or recognize the validity of one sexual orientation over another sexual orientation, those are simply challenges to the stratification system as it exists. And just like I talked about with racism, we can't ignore that those policies are there. And if they are no longer there, we can't ignore that they have had consequences that continue to be real based on sex. Whether we're talking about what that means for people who are not heterosexual, or whether we're talking about people who are not male, because we'll often, in the same way, remember I said when we're talking stratification over class, we will never ask the question on whether or not the wealthiest people have better life chances than the not wealthiest people, right? We're never confused about that. It's when they're close together that we start to have this challenge. It's harder to really filter out whether or not there is a stratification consequence for being male versus female, because there's not very much space between those two body types, right? The question is, have we had policies and systems, whether they exist today or no, that have privileged one sex over the other? And the question is, are there continuing consequences of that? So the question, why do we always talk about race? Why do we always talk about gender? It's a valid question. I'm just trying to figure out whether or not those consequences remain in that stratification system that affects people's life chances as a question of their gender, or in this case, a question of their race, because I haven't even mentioned gender definitions yet. Okay.